Maybe you need to change your diet. Maybe you need to get off the screen. When you're thinking, oh, I feel this way because my brain is messed up, you're not paying attention to your relationship to the world around you. There's a strong scientific case to make that long-term psychiatric use is actually making people sicker, more disabled in mind, body, and spirit. So when I was a 13-year-old girl growing up in a high-pressured town in New England, on paper, fit right in. I had good grades, I was a good athlete, I had it all together, so to speak. But I ended up having this really intense experience. I was acting out and yelling and screaming and terrifying my parents. I started cutting myself. I was thinking about death all the time because I just realized there's no meaning in this life. I concluded there must be something wrong with me because I want to die all the time. I can't function, can't sleep. I was put on oral contraception as a 16-year-old. The more treatment I sought and the more deferential I became to all of these well-meaning therapists and psychiatrists, the more meds I took, the more my life fell apart. We are physically disconnected, disembodied from ourselves in so many ways. We are isolated from one another in true neighborhoods and communities. We are yearning for meaning and purpose and belonging. Being human is really hard. It's meant to be.
Laura Delano, welcome to Real Talk with Zuby. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. How about you?
I am always doing great. Laura, you are the founder of something called Inner Compass, and you recently wrote and released a book called Unshrunk. What is that about?
Well, the book tells the story of my 14-year relationship with the mental health industry, by which I mean, my introduction to diagnoses as a young teenager and medications, and then basically everything that followed, and how in my late 20s, I eventually realized that these diagnoses had shaped my entire sense of self, and all of these meds that I had been on through the most formative years of my life had maybe caused me more harm than good, and that I needed to basically break up with them and leave behind this whole patient identity that was really all I knew, and figure out who I would be beyond it. And the book also weaves in the broader story of how American psychiatry evolved over the past 70, 80 years to become this very medicalized, pharmaceuticalized profession that it is today, just to show that my story happened within a much broader story of industry and commodification and, regulatory capture. Because I quickly realized when I came off all the meds 15 years ago now that my own story was about a lot more than just me and what my family went through. And just quickly about Inner Compass Initiative, the mission of this organization is to help people make informed choices about psychiatric diagnoses and medications and how to safely taper off these medications. We're not anti-drug, we're about choice and true choice and ensuring that people get all the information they need and all the options available to them so that they can actually choose, whether that's to take the meds, to come off the meds, to never start the meds. So that's what we're all about.
Awesome. Well, before we go into details of the meds in the industry, for my listeners, please tell us a little bit more about your personal story.
So when I was a 13-year-old girl growing up in a kind of affluent, high-pressured town in New England in the U.S., I, on paper, fit right in. I had good grades. I was a good athlete. I was, a student in student government. And so I had it all together, so to speak. But I ended up having this really intense experience as a girl in front of the bathroom mirror one night where I basically lost touch with space and time, and everything went black, and I was just staring at this strange girl in the mirror, someone I didn't know, someone I didn't recognize. And I ended up concluding after kind of coming to that I must not have a real self, and that all these these performance games that I'm playing are basically a prison, and I'm trapped. And who am I? What do I care about? I realized I had no power here, that I was kind of under the influence of all these adults and these social expectations. And so I ended up trying to pretend this realization hadn't happened and continue on doing, the whole good student thing. But I just kept internally, the pressure kept building, and I eventually began to break down at home. I was acting out and yelling and screaming and terrifying my parents. I started cutting myself. I was thinking about death all the time because I just realized there's no meaning in this life. I'm just a robot programmed. And I didn't talk about that with anyone. Yeah, but it ended up being, I think, what broke me down. And God bless them, my parents didn't know what to do. And this was in the mid 1990s. And so the now ubiquitous kind of mental health awareness and anti-stigma campaigns that we see all over the place that are largely industry funded weren't around yet. So it was a very private thing, especially in a town like the one I grew up in, to have intense emotional breakdown, or so they thought at least. And so they sent me to a therapist, and, it was this big secret in my family. And that therapist eventually sent me to a psychiatrist who diagnosed me in 1 hour with an incurable lifelong mental illness called bipolar disorder. And she threw me right on meds. And that was the beginning of that long relationship that I was to have with the mental health industry.
And how was that?
My initial response to this notion that something was wrong with my brain and that's why I was feeling the way I was feeling was outrage. I knew intuitively that this was absurd and that I was actually having a really meaningful response to the environment that I was in. But it's really hard to stay connected to that instinct when you're a kid and you're alone with what you believe and feel. And so I tried to pretend it wasn't true, and I avoided taking the meds whenever I could, and I went away to boarding school thinking I could run away from my psychiatrist and my parents and everything. But I was still stuck in this performance game. I was still, accomplishing, all the kind of achievements that you would do as a good student and athlete because I didn't know how to get out of it. And I eventually got into Harvard and arrived there just hoping desperately that I'd been wrong this whole time and I wasn't actually trapped in a performance game. And once I got to a school like Harvard, everything would be okay and I'd feel like I knew who I was and where I belonged and all of that. And of course that didn't happen. And so I really spun out my first year of college. I wasn't sleeping. I was doing a lot of drugs. I was having, these intense, like looping, deep racing thoughts, deconstructing space and time. I found postmodern philosophy and got completely hooked into this idea that nothing is real, everything's a social construction, and I lost it. And by the middle of my first year, I was in so much pain and I felt so hopeless and despairing that I concluded that psychiatrist must have been right. Like there must be something wrong with me because I want to die all the time. I can't function. I can't sleep. So I went back to psychiatry and embraced that bipolar diagnosis right away, embraced all these drugs that I was put on and embraced this idea that I needed all these, Harvard Medical School trained doctors to basically guide me through the rest of my life because I was just so sick. And that it was at that turning point as an 18-year-old where my yearning for relief and I think my yearning to understand myself and who I was and why I felt and thought the way I felt, it was so powerful that it prevented me from thinking critically about any of it. I just wanted to belong somewhere and I wanted relief. And psychiatry, seemed to offer me that. And so I jumped right in and became a very compliant, good, well-performing, you could say, psychiatric patient.
Yeah. And so how many meds were you on and for how long?
Yeah, the first time I was put on meds again, it was back when I was 14, and that was 2. And I was able, like I said, to not take them consistently between 14 and 18, and thank goodness for that. I should say, on a bit of a tangent, I was put on oral contraception as a 16-year-old because I was having some eating. I wasn't really eating, and I lost my period, and some ridiculous endocrinologist told my parents that the pill would nourish my body. So I was also put on oral contraception as a 16-year-old girl, and I would stay on that for 16 years. But once I restarted psych drugs as an 18-year-old, I was on them for the next decade consistently and started again with 2. But then before long, it became 3 because, adverse effects that were not being recognized as such were being then medicated with new drugs. 3 became 4, 4 became 5. And so through my late teens through my early 20s, the more treatment I sought and the more deferential I became to all of these well-meaning therapists and psychiatrists and, all these professionals I was seeing, the more I relied on what they were kind of, instructing me to do, the more meds I took, the more I internalized this idea that my emotional pain was a so-called symptom of an illness in my brain, the more my life fell apart. And to the outside observer, and, including me also, it looked like I was getting sicker, so to speak. And everyone was telling my parents that. I was believing that. And never once did any of us stop and step back and say, maybe all these meds and diagnoses are actually fueling this problem. And so by my mid-20s, I was completely dependent on my parents. I couldn't work. I weighed almost 200 pounds. I was totally cognitively impaired, really struggled to do anything consistently in my life. And we were told, unfortunately, Laura, your illness has progressed to the point where it's treatment resistant. Basically, that I was just so sick that all this treatment wasn't able to help me anymore. And it was at that point that I decided that this life wasn't worth living anymore. If this was all that was in store for me, being hospitalized and in programs and dependent on my parents, totally disabled, unable to be in relationships, unable to work, what's the point in being alive? And I tried to kill myself. And to this day, that decision I hold with a great deal of respect, however strange that might sound, because it was actually a logical decision to make given the story that the American mental health industry had taught me about myself. And of course, the problem is it was a false story. And that's why I named my book, the subtitle is A Story of Psychiatric Treatment Resistance, because it was that idea of being treatment resistant that both led me to try to end my life. And then, of course, it was resisting the very treatment that I'd been turning to that ended up saving my life too.
Wow. Well, I don't say this to people often, but I'm glad that your attempt failed. Happy that you're still here with us. What was the turning point for you?
So I obviously survived my overdose, and for 2 more years, basically did more of the same. I, was in treatment programs, unable to function. And in 2010, I was 27 at the time. There I was in this outpatient program where I spent all day, every day, sitting in groups and one-on-one therapy and hanging out at the cafeteria at the psychiatric hospital where the program was. And basically just being a professional mental patient. Like that was my job, was just treatment. And I had been, just in that milieu, and at the specific program that I was in then was a substance abuse program, because in my 20s, I eventually began having a real problem with alcohol because I was on all these meds, and getting drunk every night was the only thing that kept me from killing myself, really, for a period of time. So alcohol became a problem. So I had found my way to the substance use program, and the psychiatrist there caught wind that I was maybe feeling a little suicidal, and which I was, and he ended up forcibly hospitalizing me, involving security guards. And then, and that experience was just so, it was the first time that I had said no to the mental health system, and then seen the consequences of that, and which are basically the stripping of your civil liberties. If a mental health professional decides that you might be a threat to yourself or someone else, they have the power to strip you of all your rights, which happened. So that dislodged something in me, and I began questioning all these mental health professionals that I've been turning my life over to for so many years as a source of, the one source of care that I had. And I now realize they're actually about control. I just haven't seen this before because I've always said yes. And now that I'm saying no, I'm seeing this shadow side. And so that got me questioning other things. I had a couple more experiences with coercion. And then I found a book in the summer of 2010 called Anatomy of an Epidemic by a medical journalist. And the thesis of the book is that if you actually look at the long-term outcomes of psychiatric drugs, they tell a very different story than what we've been taught to believe. There's a strong scientific case to make that long-term psychiatric use is actually making people sicker, more disabled in mind, body, and spirit. And the book, makes a very compelling case using data and also weaving in personal stories. And I saw myself in those stories and it clicked. And I had this aha moment where I realized, what if it's not treatment-resistant mental illness that has led my life to fall apart in this way? Like, what if it's the treatment? And I had to figure out if that was the case. I was just suddenly aware that there was another possibility for my future besides what I'd been previously believing. And it was that curiosity and eventually the anger that I felt the more I began to learn and educate myself and realize, holy cow, I've been believing in a completely false, marketing story of drug companies through all these years of my life. And so that anger also fueled me to kind of take my power back, take my story back, which is why I eventually wrote my book, and take back my pain also. And from this idea of it being symptom of an illness, it was actually a response to what was happening to me.
Wow, there's a lot here to dive into. So looking back at this time with the lens and worldview that you have now, what do you think was going on during those teenage years and through your 20s? What do you think was happening?
It's a great question. Well, I think in my teen years, before I was sent to my first therapist, I was waking up. I was coming into myself as a young woman in the world. I was recognizing the kind of social expectations around me for the first time in this critical way. I was coming into self, and the kind of the prison of self, because of course when you're a tiny kid, we were talking about before we went live, our kids, and I look at my 4-year-old son and he's so in the moment of life all the time. He doesn't yet have this kind of meta realm of self where he's thinking of himself in relation to the world around him. He's just in the world. And so I think I was in this transition out of that kind of childhood wonder into, whoa, life is kind of confusing and can be really hard. And you are, as a kid, powerless in many ways. And so had that been approached with curiosity, had I had a space where I could talk maybe with someone who'd read some Huxley, or Eric Fromm, or, someone who had a framework of understanding that I was actually in a spiritual crisis that was very meaningful and wise, and that could have actually been liberating in many ways. Because I didn't have that, I think things, I got sucked into this vortex of mental health treatment. And then, from there through the rest of my teens and 20s, I think that it's impossible to disentangle how I was feeling physically, mentally, and emotionally from all the drugs that I was on, the prescribed drugs. I think they influence every facet of who you are, every single facet of yourself as a creative, spiritual, sexual, physical, emotional, cognitive being. Every facet is influenced by these drugs. And so to me, everything that happened after, I can't separate from the treatment.
Yeah. So in your particular case, do you think that the drugs just had an ill effect in terms of just, I don't know, your own body's chemistry? Because the reason why I ask that is obviously the usage of these pharmaceuticals is extremely widespread, especially in the USA, like 1 in 4 adults or something crazy like that. And I have to assume that there are some people, maybe most people who take them, they at least feel like it's beneficial to them. Obviously, with any type of drug, people are going to have different reactions and responses. So I'm trying to understand kind of what the general case is and what the exception and outlier cases are. This is not my field of knowledge, and I have no personal direct experience of it, nor do I want it. But I have to assume that the drugs do help some people. So how do you kind of parse that out?
Yeah, great question. And I agree. I do think these drugs can feel really helpful for people. And I definitely I think a lot of this comes down to the very language that we use to think about and talk about these drugs. That's where I think we get taken off track. And by that, I mean, when you're being told, oh, this despair you're feeling and this inability to get off the couch and this sense that there's no purpose to anything, these are just symptoms of some faulty brain chemistry. And, you have this illness called depression, and here's an antidepressant. It's a medicine that's going to treat your depression. Every single word in that statement is misleading and was constructed in the marketing divisions of drug companies and by industry funded, psychiatric guild organizations to kind of create the permission structure for using pharmaceutical drugs as a first line treatment. And so when someone's told that story, that's going to shape their relationship to these drugs, to their pain, to themselves in profound ways. And that is where I think people are deeply misled, because if you feel helped on a drug and you think it's because there's something wrong with your biology that this drug is adjusting, that's just not true. But if you use more common sense, straightforward language to talk about these drugs, and there's a psychiatrist named Joanna Moncrief who writes so articulately about this, and this is where I learned this framing. When you talk about these drugs as psychoactive chemicals like alcohol and coffee and nicotine and cocaine, and they work, so to speak, by disrupting normal bodily functions, and that disruption can sometimes feel helpful. Like if you have intense social anxiety, you might feel really helped by drinking a glass of wine at a party, but it's not because there was something wrong with your brain that the alcohol is treating. The alcohol is disrupting your regular state, and the byproduct of that feels helpful because it's slowing you down. It's suppressing stress response. And so that to me is why I think these drugs can be really helpful for people, because they're psychoactive chemicals. And psychoactive chemicals can be really helpful, especially when used in the short term. And that, I think, is where a big piece of this crisis that we're in as a culture in America, and increasingly the rest of the Western world and even beyond the Western world, we talk all the time about this mental health crisis that we're in, quote unquote, where more people are suffering, feeling suicidal, having anxiety, unable to function in their lives. And people think, oh, it must be because we don't have enough treatment. People aren't getting good access to care. But if you actually look at the numbers of people engaging with the mental health industry, like you said, the numbers are astronomical. And so I think a big part of why rates of mental and emotional distress are increasing is actually because people are engaged in long-term psychiatric treatment, including both the diagnostic stories that they're told about themselves, but also these drugs that were never studied for long-term use. They were never intended for long-term use. And when you actually look at what outcomes do exist for long-term use, they're really poor. It's obviously much more complicated than that, why people are struggling today, but I think that's a big piece of it for sure.
Yeah. Do you know what the origin of this whole spiel is, from the quote unquote chemical imbalance theory to just this idea that drugs, pharmaceuticals, are the sort of first line response to any negative feeling, emotional issue that people are having? You said that earlier on in the podcast, you said something about how in the past 70 or 80 years in the USA in particular, there's been, I don't know, this sort of rise of these pharmaceutical drugs. So can you tell me a little bit about the history and the story there? Where does this all come from?
And I go into this in my book too, because I was fascinated. I wanted to really figure this out for myself as I was piecing together what happened to me. And what I found is that really beginning in the mid 20th century, but the seeds were planted a little bit before that, there was this deep kind of identity crisis within the psychiatric profession. Historically, psychiatrists had really praised themselves as artists. There was no pretense that this was a scientific medical endeavor. They recognized that they were tending to the spirit, to the human spirit, and that when people fell into crisis, what they often needed was actually true asylum in the original sense of the word, a safe haven from the storms of life, the chance to reconnect with nature, with a sense of solitude, to work with your hands in the garden, to move your body. I'm not at all painting a overly romanticized picture of early psychiatry, because they were also doing barbaric things as well, pulling out teeth and giving people, injecting people with viruses. But no one was operating under the assumption that they were practicing medicine. There was a recognition this was something else. And towards the mid 20th century, there was this kind of internal struggle within the profession where a small group of self-described biological psychiatrists kind of decided, we're going to rebrand ourselves as this medical enterprise, and we're going to study brains and, find the cause of madness and somewhere in the brain. We don't know where, but we're going to find it. And let's just talk as though we know in the meantime. And so psychoanalysis versus, pharmaceutical prescribing, and have had this head to head, and biological psychiatry won out. And the first psychiatric drug was kind of accidentally discovered in the early mid 50s. It was being looked at for other purposes, and then the researchers noticed the rodents they were experimenting on didn't care what was done to them, and they were like, oh, this could have application in those back wards of all these institutions where people are living years just like not functioning, and that is what set off this kind of new domain of pharmaceutical. Yeah, it opened up a new market share, you could say. And when it really took off was with Prozac in the late 80s. And that began the kind of modern psychopharmacological era, where the 90s were officially declared by the first Bush as the decade of the brain. And it was kind of officially established that this decade we are going to discover how the brain works. We're going to solve, all the mysteries. And so it was in that context that psychiatry, really took off as this like reductionist, brain-based, drug-based field that really became like ubiquitous at that point. And that was also the point at which industry began to really influence the culture, I think, through funding mental health awareness campaigns and campaigns encouraging people to fight the stigma, and I'm sure you see that all over the place yourself. And it's unfortunate because the underlying message is true. We shouldn't be alone with our suffering and pain. We should be able to talk about it with each other. But that's not really what these campaigns are about. These campaigns are about there's no shame in embracing being mentally ill and needing treatment. Like that's kind of what these campaigns are really about. And I came of age in this decade of the brain in the mid-90s. So I was like perfect, it was like fate that I would get sucked into this as a sensitive, intense kid that I was.
What's the difference between mental health and mental illness? Well, maybe I didn't frame that question perfectly, but when like the terms, like it seems clear that there are actual mental illnesses that do exist, right? Like on the extreme end where people are like totally not functional. But especially over the last 15, 20 years in particular, I know it started earlier than that, there's been this sort of rising concept of, mental health and mental health issues, which are not necessarily the same as someone being mentally ill, but the terms seem to get kind of conflated. It's a little mixed up. I don't know if there is like a formal difference, but what's your perspective on that?
Oh, I love that you're bringing this up. I love this. I actually don't think there is much difference between the concept of mental illness and mental health. They're really the flip side of the same medicalized coin, you could say. And by that, I mean, like you said, there are people who are really struggling, people who are, delusional and hallucinating and like profoundly suicidal and can't leave their house because of panic attacks. Suffering and madness are very real and can be very terrifying, very disabling. But to take it a step further to say that these are all illnesses in one's brain, like this idea of mental illness. The illness lives in my mind, which is kind of conflated with the brain. So there is a lot of conflating going on. These are kind of mushy words that when you actually step back, you're like, this doesn't mean anything. And yet they're so powerful in our culture that you hear the phrase mental illness or you hear the phrase mental health, and it just connotes all these, you make all these associations in your head. But when you actually think about it, like it's a meaningless phrase. It's not saying anything. And so I think for me, the medicalization of human experiences is where the problem lies, because suffering is very real. People can lose their minds and go crazy, and sometimes for actual biological reasons. You can have a brain tumor that makes you hallucinate. You can have late stage Lyme disease. You can, there can be physiological causes of madness. But that's different than the realm of psychiatry, which is saying your madness, your suffering is because of faulty brain chemistry. And so to me, the work that I do and what I share about in my book and what we talk about through Inner Compass Initiative is this idea of embracing the reality of pain and suffering and madness, but inviting people to move beyond this idea of reducing it to health or illness and kind of reclaim it from this medicalized space. Because when you're thinking of your experiences as medical, then the solutions you're looking for are medical too. And it cuts off the opportunity to make meaning of your experiences in different ways. Like maybe you need to change your diet. Maybe you need to get off the screen. Maybe you were, in a really stressful situation at home or at work, or you lost a loved one. But when you're thinking, oh, I feel this way because my brain is messed up, you're not paying attention to your relationship to the world around you. And that's really, I think, what I'm trying to invite people to reconsider, is that pain happens for reasons.
Yeah, that's such an important point. I mean, just looking at the numbers, it seems obvious to me, very, very obvious, that there's massive overdiagnosing going on, right? I mean, it cannot be the case that 20-something% of American adults have like a mental illness, right? Which they didn't before in previous generations, by the way, and which in most other countries 1 in 4 people don't. Things like that. Like it just seems like common sense, which I know is now uncommon. That okay, like how are suddenly so many young people having all of these issues, right? Like depression rates, especially from like the diagnosed depression rates, diagnosed anxiety rates, or self-diagnosed, especially from like the mid 2000s. Lo and behold, smartphones, social media, those have all just been skyrocketing in various age groups, particularly amongst young people. We see these various social contagions going on from, people literally, going as far as identifying or believing they're literally the opposite gender, to all of a sudden all these teenagers having PTSD and like all just there's very clearly something weird going on. And as you know, one of the big problems is trying to have like a serious conversation about this, because the propaganda and marketing has been pushed so hard for so long, and so many people now identify into these things. Something I find very strange in the West is like how defensive and protective people are about their like quote unquote mental health issues. Like it's a kind of badge of honor, especially in certain circles, right? Like if you are just normal and healthy and you don't have depression, anxiety, so on and so forth, like you're kind of deemed the weird one in some circles. Like people bond around this. People put it in their social media bios, like, they put all the conditions that they claim they have. And it makes it very difficult to have like a proper nuanced conversation about it for a lot of people, because they're so worried about stepping on someone's toe or minimizing someone's suffering or sounding like they're anti-science or getting some kind of label attached to them. And I'm blessed to have a personality type where I just don't care about stuff like that. So people can criticize me all day long and it's all good. I enjoy it. But I recognize most people are not wired with that type of personality. And ultimately, I do care about helping people just like you do. And the current approach, I have not seen a lot of evidence that it's helping people. It seems the more mental health awareness we have, and the more therapy we have, and the more therapy language we have in our culture, and the more drugs people are on, the worse things get, right? I'm not seeing evidence that all of this is getting better. It quite clearly seems to be getting worse. And the solution seems to be, okay, we need even more drugs and more therapy and more talking about all of these problems on a superficial level. And outside of, podcasts, outside of podcasts like this, you don't kind of get much of the alternative perspective and trying to really understand, the human condition and the fact that, yes, we all suffer and everyone goes through suffering and we're all going to get sick and every single person is going to die and bad things happen all over the place. Like there are a lot of reasons to feel depressed. Like I give people that. There are lots of reasons to feel anxious, but that doesn't mean that you're mentally ill or that you have some problem that we need to, fix with a drug. So I've said a lot there.
I'm just nodding the whole time as you're speaking. You nailed it. We are in, I look at how the romanticization of being sick, quote unquote, and needing treatment, quote unquote. I was the beginning of that phenomenon as an elder millennial. It was just starting to unfold as when I was entering adolescence. And so I know what it's like to be a sensitive person who's feeling pain, who feels lost and confused, and who wants to belong somewhere, and who wants to be seen and understood, who wants that pain to be recognized and validated. I did end up trying to meet those needs by getting psychiatrized. And now it seems as though almost like I was even go so far as to say the majority of young people are now on that same path as I was back when I was, more like a lone wolf in this, in the 90s with this. Now it seems to be everywhere. And I think it does speak to, it's a symptom, to use a medical word, of this deeper spiritual crisis, I think, that we're in as a culture, where between, digitized existence and, industrialized lifestyles, we are, physically disconnected, disembodied from ourselves in so many ways. We are isolated from one another in true neighborhoods and communities. We are yearning for meaning and purpose and belonging. And there is a void of finding that. It's as though the mental health industry is like the only visible place right now, or seems like one of the most visible places right now, where you can find this illusory sense of belonging and self-understanding. And I think, it's at the point where it can't go on much longer. I've been doing this work for 15 years, and I feel something shifting in our culture. I think people are beginning to wake up from this spell of not just medicalization, of, reducing yourself into medical diagnoses, needing medical treatment, but also the other component is the professionalization of care and the commodification of care, that when you are struggling and you need help and you need support, for a lot of people, especially young people, the only help on offer in their mind is a paid professional, someone who's giving you a service. You're paying them money to give you a service that's deceptively called care, but it's not actually true care. True care is given freely and from the heart and in a kind of mutual fellow human capacity, not, professional client or professional patient. And this isn't me saying all therapy is bad, but I think it's taken on this monopoly in our culture of help. But when people think of help, they think of therapy. And similar to how I feel about moving beyond medicalization, beyond medicalized language to talk about suffering, I want to move beyond professionalization when we talk about help too, because all these young people who are, having their Zoom sessions with their therapists and then spending 8 hours on TikTok before they take their 4 meds, it's not even occurring to them the power that they would find if they reconnected in real life with each other and talked about their respective struggles free from clinicalese, just using human language, like poetic, creative language to describe what they're feeling and experiencing. I think we're reaching a tipping point, though, where that is going to start happening more. I feel really optimistic. Things are shifting, and I hope we're waking up from this, because, the consequences are dire for the future of our civilization if everyone's just self-identifying with all these diagnoses and filling their bodies with these potent psychoactive drugs that were never intended to be used for the long term or in combination with each other. Yeah.
What are some of the long-term consequences of this?
Oh my goodness. Well, I mean, and some of the consequences are short-term too, but in terms of, I'll just focus on SSRIs for the moment because those are one of the most widely prescribed drug classes. So for anyone not familiar, it's a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. It's classed as an antidepressant. There are other types of antidepressants too. And again, antidepressant is marketing language. It's not actually an accurate description of what this drug is. The serotonin system is about so much more than feel-good chemicals in your brain. Your gut, your digestive system is, the vast majority of our serotonin receptors are there. They control all kinds of basic bodily functions and like muscle and musculature, all these kinds of things. So when people are on SSRIs for the long term, they often have digestive issues, muscle problems, chronic pain, and perhaps the most common, one of the most shocking adverse effects that's finally getting recognition is that the numbing effects of these drugs, which can be emotional numbing, but also sexual numbing. There's now a whole population of people who, some of whom, myself included, lose sexual function on these drugs. I had zero sexual function through my teens and 20s, none whatsoever. And I thought it was me. I had no idea it was the drugs. For some people, they actually have sexual function on SSRIs, and then when they stop, they lose it and have total numbness, no function whatsoever. And that's just like one drug class, one subsection of adverse effects. They're like multiple drug classes, all. It's so vast, the adverse effects. For me, it was, metabolic issues, autoimmune issues, weight gain, digestive problems, chronic pain, chronic headaches, memory issues, cognitive issues. I had so many problems on long-term psych drugs, and I wasn't connecting the dots. It was only when I got off of them, which I did way too fast, and I hope we can touch on that at some point, the importance of tapering slowly. But it was only when I gave myself enough time to heal from all the pharmaceutical trauma that I realized the depth of the impacts that the drugs had had on me.
Yeah, it's scary. I mean, it's a really bizarre thing to me because I know how common it's become, but at the same time, it's like a very foreign concept to me. And again, it just seems to me like it just seems obvious to me as a non-medical professional, but someone who I guess I'm a smart guy, that if something is environmentally caused, then the solution is environmental, right? But I guess the reason that's not obvious is because there was the mainstreaming of this whole chemical imbalance idea, telling people, millions of people, maybe billions, that no, there's just something like wrong with your brain. The reason why you're feeling sad, the reason why you're feeling anxious, the reason why you don't have energy, whatever the case may be, it's not because of things happening in your life or stages you're going through. It's because you just have this sort of fundamental thing wrong with you. It's such an interesting topic, though, because I'm not going to go like ultra deep on this podcast, but like it's connected to so many other things. And I think part of the problem that we're experiencing in like the modern Western world is a real hesitancy and fear to go genuinely deep on some of these issues. Okay? So in my opinion, if you really, really wanted to tackle the root of this, we're going to have to talk about spirituality and God and faith and family and meaning and purpose. You're gonna have to like dive into all of these, and I think people are like really, really uncomfortable. Even a lot of people are uncomfortable even hearing those words, right? Like if you even say spiritual, or if you mention God, or if you talk about like the breakdown of family, which has been horrific in the U.S. over the last few decades, people are like, no, it can't be that. So people are very comfortable to talk about smartphones. They're comfortable to talk about the effects of social media. Maybe they're comfortable to talk about diet and exercise, even though that's also a little bit touchy for some people. But like kind of going deep and going to the root, no one wants to do that. And so I think it's much faster and more appealing and actually more popular, less controversial to just be like, oh, there's just, you've just stick a label on it. And then once you've got the label, you've also got the drug with a label on it. It's like, okay, this is for this, this is for this, this is for this. And no one is really going to criticize you if you play that game. Whereas if you take the position of like, oh, no, that's not really what's going on with the vast majority of people. Right? We don't suddenly have 25% of adults in the U.S. just like being mentally ill out of nowhere. Like that's not what's going on. If you do that, you're the bad guy, right? You get demonized. People say you're minimizing people's suffering. You're unsympathetic. You're unempathetic. You hate science. You're anti this. You're anti that. You're probably like racist and transphobic and homophobic to boot. Just throw it in there. You're probably a fascist, and it's just silly. It would just be silly, but it's darker than that because it stops you from getting to the root cause. And if you can't get to the root cause, you can't genuinely help people. Sure, you can numb people's emotions, right? You can give people some drug that cuts off some hormone and makes them feel or not feel a certain way, but it's a Band-Aid on a bullet wound, right? Like it's not, you're not getting to the root of it.
Yep. Yeah. Well, I mean, the bind is that to get to the root, you have to feel the pain. The pain is a signal, whether it's physical pain and chronic health issues or mental and emotional pain, to actually have the chance to truly find your way to, what the real problems are. You have to feel it. You have to feel it all. And so, yeah, these industries, and you could, even I get super cynical about how even in the areas where people are critiquing, drug companies, they're still in the same, the wellness industry, you could argue is kind of the new big pharma, where it's still the same kind of quick fix Band-Aid solution. And it's still superficial. It's still not getting to the root, but, our supplements are going to save you, or, our app that is going to help you track your whatever is going to save you. It's almost more insidious, more dangerous, I think, because of how insidious it is. And to me, the quick fix mentality and this quest for relief will only perpetuate the very pain and suffering that people are trying to fix and get relief from in the first place. And the more systems we build and the more solutions we purport, are on offer, the worse the suffering is going to get. It's what you were saying earlier. It has this paradoxical effect of worsening the very thing that it's setting out to help address. And this is the work of Ivan Illich, who, back in the 70s wrote this incredible book, Medical Nemesis, and he wrote about all the different spheres of life, the schooling system, medical system, the kind of transportation and language. He looked at all these different arenas of life where we build systems whose purposes are to fix problems, but because these systems disable people from their own ability to help themselves and each other in true independent autonomous communities, these problems just get worse and worse and worse. And we're definitely, looking, this is why so many people are suffering in many ways. And but yeah, to your point, to get to the root, to actually go deep requires a lot of work. If you're actually going to address what you find there, and who has time for that? Who wants to, completely extricate themselves from the conventional school system? Like, once you realize what conventional schooling can do to a kid's spirit, for as one example, people are busy and they'd rather just, keep the blinders on. And I get it. It's really hard to be human in the modern world, and I don't judge them for it. But yeah, going deep is not something we're doing a lot of.
No, we're really not. I think that's something that previous generations and our ancestors were generally better at. So I don't know. We live in such a strange time. Something that was on my mind is, as you were speaking, is sometimes I wonder how much of this is just connected to ease of life and ease of survival, as as much of an oxymoron or paradox that may sound. Like, I do often wonder, especially when I look at so many things happening in the West and in developed, more economically developed countries, and even pockets of them. Like, I would imagine, like, some of these issues I'd imagine there's probably higher antidepressant route in usage in, like, the more affluent areas, for example. I don't know if that's true, but I would guess that it is. Certainly there's more therapy and stuff going on. And I do wonder if there's something about ease of survival that causes more just navel gazing and mental health problems and people feeling all these things, right? Because instead of doing, right? In the past, people were doing, right? Like, your body is physically moving, you're spending time outside, there's not artificial light, like, you're in communities, you're surrounded by people, like, you're just living a much more naturally integrated life. Whereas for most modern men and women in the West or in developed countries, we live very artificial lives. And I say this as someone who does it myself, right? I'm sitting here, staring into a camera, and I've got these big artificial lights on me, and I'm, sitting in this climate controlled room. And yes, I'm talking to someone, but we're not doing it like in person and so on. So like, I even, I'm very conscious of this in my own life, right? How much time we just spend staring at screens, big screens, small screens, median screens. Most people eat terrible diets. Most people don't sleep enough. Most people are, not, people don't take care of themselves very well. And yeah, people are quote unquote busy, but like busy doing what exactly? I think a lot of people are just like wrapped up in this thing, and I don't know, like kind of trapped in the matrix, and they don't pull themselves out for you at least need to take breaks. You at least need to take breaks from it. Because like, look, if I were trying to create a population where people feel anxious and depressed, it would be hard to formulate a better scenario than how so many hundreds of millions of modern people live. Feed them garbage diet, make sure they don't get enough sleep, barely go outside, live a very sedentary lifestyle, be isolated, strip away faith, strip away family, strip away community, bombard them nonstop with negative news through their screens, whether it's television, whether it's social media, make sure that they're constantly, aware of everything bad that's going on all of the time. And then I'd continue to tell them and reinforce that, they've got something wrong with them. And of course, I have the solution if you pay me the right amount. It's like this perfect blend of, well, you look at it all and I'm like, well, yeah, of course people are feeling depressed and anxious. Like I would too. If I was if I was living like this, then I probably would as well, But instead of thinking of it that way, it's just like, oh no, obviously the solution is a pill.
Oh yeah, and to me this topic we've been talking about in this episode is the linchpin of all of this, because when you realize how disempowered and disabled you've been by modern industrial living, that basically everything you're interacting with on a day-to-day basis, you have no idea how it's made. You couldn't repair it if you needed to. You're getting food shipped from other countries. When you realize how dependent you are on industry to survive, what do you do? What do you do from there? And I think what is within our reach, and it's why I do the work that I do, is the relationship we have to our emotions is in right here. We have the power right here and now to change that. We don't need to, move from a city and go buy land and become self-sufficient and go off the grid. For some people who are able to do that, all the power to them. Most of us can't, but we can change our relationship to emotional pain, and we must, because the anxiety and despair and anger, all the emotions that so many of us are feeling are the catalyst. It's actually feeling them and listening to them and recognizing the wisdom in them that will be what helps us actually change our world. And as long as we are medicalizing our emotional pain and taking it to a professional to treat with pills and whatever therapeutic modality is, the fad of the moment, we will be distracted and disconnected from the fuel that we need to actually take our power back and rebuild our local communities and help families, come back together. We need to feel our emotional pain. It's the wisest thing about us. It doesn't mean we need to then make it our identity and make it become the most important thing about who we are, but it's a signal and we need to listen to it. And that becomes almost impossible to do when you are translating it into a symptom to be treated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I call it pathologizing the human condition.
Oh,
I think
yeah.
that there's been far too much of that. Sadness has become depression, worry has become having anxiety, going through a bad issue has become post-traumatic stress disorder. Like everything's just getting labeled. I mean, even
Yeah.
I don't know, being a bit quirky, having a lot of energy is ADHD. Um, being a little
Yep.
quirky or antisocial is autism now. Like suddenly everyone's autistic. Like I don't know. It's very weird. It's very weird when the language just changes, and things which used to be very rare or minority or almost unheard of suddenly become like, gosh, how have suddenly 30, 40, 50% of people all supposedly got one of these conditions? Like, it wasn't like that when I was a little kid. And I don't think that, humans have changed that much in that short of a time. And if they have, why is it only happening in certain places? Like, it doesn't seem convincing to me. I don't know.
Yep. Yeah. No, it's usually, there's a new on patent drug to market, and that's often a part of it too. But yeah, I think as we move forward from here, when I think about, because first of all, people often, hear me talk, or they hear a summary of my story and they conclude, oh, so now you're happy and healthy, mentally healthy, and everything's great. Oh, psychiatry harmed you, and now you're doing great. And I find myself in this like interesting position where I'm actually like, oh no, actually, if I cared enough to sit, or if I thought it made sense to sit in front of a psychiatrist, they could definitely give me some of their diagnoses today. Like, I just don't care. It doesn't mean anything to me. It's a completely subjective work of fiction that has no significance about my life. And I do feel I'm an intense person. I feel a lot of angst on a day-to-day basis when I'm not in a routine, getting outside, moving my body in contemplative practice, which I have not been for 5 years since giving birth and writing a book, and things have been busy. I am far from my best self. And so I find myself in this interesting place of having to, basically say like, no, I'm actually like crazy a lot. And but the difference is that I'm not afraid of it. And I know why I feel the way I feel. I understand that it's in large part because of the stress that I've chosen to have in my life, and all the, exercise that I'm choosing not to do right now, and all these things. And so I guess what I'm saying is that I think we all, making space for the reality of emotional pain is so important. And how do we do that without further reinforcing this deep identification with it? Because for me, what I would say has been the most liberating thing is both letting go of the fear that I once had of my pain, and also letting go of needing to actually like spend that much time thinking about it or talking about it or trying to define it for myself or trying to explain it. My attention isn't on it anymore. And sometimes it's forced to be. Sometimes, I'm so spun out. I'm like, oh my gosh, I haven't been outside today. Go for a walk around the neighborhood. I have to listen to it sometimes. But most of the time I feel these waves of emotion, and I say, it's being human. And I think the more we model that, and the more we talk about that, and the more we do validate how much pain you do feel being here, that will just slowly invite people to kind of disentangle themselves from this idea of it being the most important thing about who they are. It kind of becomes this like mundane, it's being human. Being human is really hard. It's meant to be.
Yes, and it always has been. And it always has been. Laura, before we close out, there's one thing I wanted to just quickly circle back to, because you mentioned it earlier, and that was the importance of people tapering off these medications. So do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Oh, thank you for remembering that. Yeah, so what most of us have not been told is that when you take any psychiatric medication for any length of time, your body can become physically dependent on it, in the way that, when you drink coffee for years and you stop abruptly, you might have horrible migraines and irritability and whatnot. Something about these drugs in particular make the withdrawal for a lot of people far more brutal than quitting coffee, though. And we don't understand why yet. Research there's very little research into it. But the critical thing to keep in mind is that if you're on a psychiatric medication or someone you care about is, if you decide you don't want to take it anymore, it's really important to spend time educating yourself about what slow tapering looks like. Our Inner Compass initiative has a free tapering manual there that explains what it looks like. It's slow tapering for many people is not weeks or months. For some people, it needs to take years to avoid these brutal withdrawal symptoms that for some people are completely disabling. And so doctors are not trained in this. They don't understand. There are very few number of doctors in the world who understand what slow tapering looks like. It's really lay people who've had to figure it out for themselves, how to taper off both at a slow rate and in a hyperbolic way, which means, each time you're making a reduction, it's getting progressively smaller over time. The doctors who do know about this tapering have actually learned from former patients about this because, again, there's been no research. So please, to anyone thinking about this, take all the time you can to educate yourself. Visit Inner Compass, visit other sources that have good information on slow tapering, because it can be years of disabling problems that not everyone is in a position to be able to navigate. And we need to spread awareness about this because very few people know. It's not a relapse when you stop your med abruptly. That's withdrawal. And to mitigate that, if you do it much more slowly, it might look very different.
Laura, thank you for spending this time. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for sharing your insights and wisdom. And where can people find and follow you online? And importantly, where can they check out your book?
Thanks for having me, Zuby. It's so good to be here with you and talk about all this. You can find me at lauradelano.com. You can find my book at unshrunkthebook.com. And I'm on X at Laura Delano. I'm on Instagram too. I don't even remember my handle there, but especially find me on X. And please reach out to me if you read my book, you want to connect, share your story, find me through my website. Oh, and quickly, Inner Compass Initiative, the nonprofit that helps people make informed choices about all this stuff. We are theinnercompass.org.
Laura Delano, thanks for coming on the show. I appreciate it.